This happened to me a few years ago during a trip to China. I was exploring some remote villages in Guizhou for a photography project. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by mountains and rivers, but it had a heavy atmosphere, hard to describe. One night, while driving back to the inn, my guide told me about a famous bridge in the area called the Crying Woman's Bridge. He said people avoided crossing it at night, especially alone. When I asked why, he just shook his head and said, "You don't want to know." I laughed, thinking it was just a story to scare tourists. But after I dropped him off at his village and continued alone to the inn, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. I've always been curious about local legends, and honestly, I thought it might be interesting to see the bridge for myself, just to check if there was anything unusual about it. When my GPS showed a detour that led directly to the bridge, I thought it was a funny coincidence. It seemed like a perfect chance to see the place the guide had mentioned, even if it was just an overblown story. When I reached the bridge, it looked ordinary, but the atmosphere was strange. The air felt colder than the rest of the drive, and the sound of the river below was much louder than I had expected. I stopped the car for a moment, debating whether to step out and take a picture or just continue on. Something about the place made me hesitate, but my curiosity won out. I decided to get out of the car. After all, how scary could a bridge really be? The bridge itself looked completely normal at first glance. I grabbed my camera from the back seat, planning to snap a few photos. It looked old, but nothing unusual, just a bunch of weathered stones with cracks and patches of moss here and there. The river below rushed noisily, and tall trees surrounded the area, casting shadows that made it darker than it should have been, even under a clear sky. There was no lighting at all, just the headlights of my car behind me. I walked to the middle of the bridge and looked down at the river. The water was rushing fast, but it was hard to see clearly in the darkness. I took a few photos and gave the place one last look. It seemed completely empty. There was no one else around, just the sound of the river and the wind. It was an interesting spot, but after a few minutes, I felt like I'd seen enough. I took a selfie with my phone before heading back to the car to continue to the inn. I got to the inn late that night, exhausted from a day of driving and exploring. I took a quick shower and collapsed into bed, but my curiosity about the photos I'd taken wouldn't let me sleep. I grabbed my camera and started going through the images. Most of them were what I expected: beautiful landscapes, shots of the villages, and the river running under the bridge. Then I looked at the photos I'd taken with my phone, trying to pick one to post on Instagram. When I reached the last picture, something caught my attention immediately. In the corner of the image, near the railing, there was a white figure. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from the moon or the headlights of my car. But when I zoomed in, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just a blur. It looked like a person, a vague figure with human-like contours, but definitely someone or something was there. The next day, I couldn't get the photo out of my head. I showed it to my guide, expecting him to say it was just a reflection or something normal. As soon as he saw it, his face turned pale. "You were on the bridge last night?" he asked. I nodded, and he gave me a serious look. "You shouldn't have gone there alone, especially at night." That's when he told me the legend of the Crying Woman's Bridge. According to him, many years ago, a young woman and her small child were crossing the bridge during a storm. The river's current was strong, and at some point, the child slipped and fell into the water. The mother jumped in after him, but couldn't save him. She spent hours screaming and crying in the river before disappearing herself. Her body was found days later, caught in the rocks downstream. But there was more. My guide said that ever since then, people who cross the bridge at night have reported seeing a woman in white, crying near the railing. In some cases, she asks for help, as if she's still searching for her child. But if you approach her or respond, they say she becomes violent, pushing people toward the river. Others say that if you ignore her cries, she'll appear to you later, trying to lure you back to the bridge. "One thing's certain," he said. "Anyone who encounters her carries the weight of her tragedy, and it doesn't always end well." I tried to laugh it off to ease the tension, but his words stayed with me. Against my guide's advice, I went back to the bridge that night. I wasn't sure if it was curiosity or stubbornness, but I felt like I needed to understand what had happened. When I arrived, the place felt even more desolate and isolated than the night before. I parked in the same spot and started walking onto the bridge. As I walked, I took more photos, but everything seemed normal. When I reached the middle of the bridge, I felt a strange chill, like someone was watching me. Out of curiosity, I said, "Is anyone here?" That's when I heard it, a faint sobbing, almost like a soft wail, coming from the railing. I looked in the direction of the sound, but at first, I didn't see anything. I thought maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. But then, when I took another step, she was there. A woman, kneeling by the railing, wearing a white dress, her shoulders trembling as if she were crying. I froze in place, the cold creeping over me. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the woman kneeling at the railing. My curiosity outweighed my fear at that moment, so I asked in a trembling voice, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no response. She remained motionless, as if she hadn't heard me at all. I started backing away slowly, feeling like I'd seen enough. But as I took a few steps, I heard something else. A soft cry, followed by words I couldn't understand. I turned, and what I saw made me freeze. Where the woman had been, there was now a dark shadow, almost indistinct, crouched by the railing. Panic set in. I tried to hurry off the bridge, but it was wet, and my foot slipped on a smooth stone. I lost my balance and almost fell into the river. Instinctively, I threw myself sideways, hitting my arm hard on the ground. The pain was immediate. I thought I might have broken something, but what paralyzed me was the sound that followed. I heard a child crying, faint but close. Then, a woman's voice screamed desperately, as if calling out for someone. A buzzing noise filled my head. As I struggled to get up, still on the ground, I felt something. Wet, cold hands were gripping my body. The adrenaline took over, and I didn't feel the pain in my arm as I jumped up and ran like my life depended on it. I didn't look back, not even for a second. When I got to my car, I slammed the door shut and sped away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the inn, where I spent the rest of the night trying to process what had happened. The next day, I went to the hospital to treat my arm. It wasn't serious, but they told me to avoid straining it, which meant I couldn't use my camera for a while. Unable to continue my project and still shaken by what I'd experienced, I decided to cut my trip short. I've never been back to that place, and I still avoid looking at the photos I took that night.
I never imagined I'd write something like this, but after what happened, I feel like I need to share it, even if many people won't believe what I'm about to say. Maybe it's a way to process what I experienced. This happened a few years ago during a trip to Shanghai with a group of friends. We had just graduated from college, and the plan was to explore the city in a unique way, off the beaten tourist path. That's how we ended up at the abandoned hospital. I don't remember exactly whose idea it was. I think it was Lou, a friend who lived in China and knew some local stories. He mentioned the hospital as a challenge that local teens like to do, a kind of dare to enter the place at night and see who had the courage to walk through its halls. It sounded like just another exaggerated urban legend meant to spook tourists. At first, everyone laughed and said it was nonsense, but in the end, curiosity won out. It was almost midnight when we arrived. The hospital was in a remote neighborhood on the outskirts of Shanghai, surrounded by old buildings and abandoned factories. Just the walk to the location was unsettling. The hospital's facade was deteriorated, with broken windows and the main entrance blocked by rusted metal sheets. We found a way in through the side, where a gate had been ripped off years ago. As soon as we stepped through the first door, the smell hit us, a mix of hospital disinfectant, mold, and something I can only describe as rotten. The place was completely empty, but there were still remnants of what it once was: rusted gurneys left in corners, scraps of medical records and medicine boxes scattered across the floor, and light fixtures hanging precariously by frayed wires. Some rooms even had remnants of patients' belongings. Sometimes, I thought I saw shadows moving through the windows of the rooms, but I chalked it up to fear starting to play tricks on my mind. As we explored, Lou told us the hospital's story. He said it had been shut down suddenly in the 1980s after a series of strange events. Many patients reportedly heard voices from people who weren't there, and some staff members vanished without a trace. The government never explained why the hospital was abandoned so abruptly, and the rumors only grew over time. The creepiest part was about the emergency lights. According to legend, they still flickered even though the building had no power. I thought it was just an exaggeration until I saw it for myself. At the end of a long hallway, a red light was flashing intermittently, as if trying to grab our attention. There was no sound of a generator or any indication the building had electricity, but there it was, blinking. We stopped and exchanged nervous glances but decided to keep going. Lou took the lead, and I followed closely behind. He said he wanted to see if the light was coming from an old, active cable, but I was already regretting stepping into this place. The deeper we went, the stranger the atmosphere became. We started hearing noises. At first, they were faint, like light footsteps or something scraping against the floor. We stopped every time we heard them, but the sound stopped too. When we resumed walking, the noises would start again, as if something, or someone, was following us. I tried convincing myself it was just the wind or the old, deteriorated building settling, but honestly, it sounded like human footsteps. We eventually reached the room where the red light was coming from. It was an old surgical room. The door was slightly ajar, and we could see the red glow pulsing inside. Lou went in first. When I stepped through the doorway, I was shocked. The room was completely intact, unlike the rest of the hospital. The surgical equipment was still in place, though the tables were dusty and stained, and the floor had dark marks. The red light came from a small emergency lamp above the door, blinking slowly. That's when we heard the voices. They came from the hallway we had just walked through. It was a low sound, like someone trying to speak but unable to form words. Lou quickly turned to me, his eyes wide, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, the sound grew louder. It was getting closer. And then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, like someone running toward us. We froze. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. Lou pointed to the opposite door and shouted, "Run!" We bolted without looking back. The footsteps echoed behind us, relentless. Strangely, no matter how fast we ran, the sound never faded, it was always just a few steps behind us. When we finally reached the side exit, Lou tripped and fell. I turned to help him, but that's when I saw something in the hallway we had just come from. It was a silhouette, tall and thin, standing against the darkness. It had no face, or at least none that I could make out, and there were other dark shadows moving behind it. I grabbed Lou with all the strength I had, and we ran until we made it to the street. We didn't stop until we reached the car. None of us could believe what had just happened. When I looked back at the hospital from the car, I swear I saw the same figure standing on the second floor, watching us from one of the broken windows. I've never gone back there. Lou doesn't like to talk about it either. Sometimes I wonder if it was some kind of shared hallucination or if we truly saw something that shouldn't have been there. What I do know is that, to this day, just thinking about that silhouette makes me uneasy. And those footsteps. No matter how much I try to rationalize it, I can't find an explanation for what happened that night. I've never been afraid of dolls. My younger sister, Sophia, has always been obsessed with them, and the house was full of them. Porcelain dolls on the shelves, Barbies scattered on the floor, rag dolls tossed in the corner of the bed. It was common to trip over one in the hallway, especially at night when I'd get up to grab a drink of water. They were just toys. At least, that's what I thought. It all started when my Aunt Helena, during an unexpected visit, gave Sophia a doll that, according to her, had a story. I didn't know what she meant at the time, and I didn't care. It was a porcelain doll, very detailed, with glass eyes and a painted mouth that seemed always on the verge of a smile. Helena said she found it during a trip to China and thought Sophia would love it. The moment Sophia took the doll, I felt something was off. She went oddly quiet, as if the presence of that toy had changed the atmosphere in the room. That night, Sophia wouldn't let go of the doll. She kept it in her lap during dinner, held it while watching TV, and took it with her to bed. Normal, I thought. Kids get attached to weird things sometimes. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I'm not a light sleeper, but I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. My room was next to Sophia's, and the sound seemed to come from there. It was subtle, like something moving slowly, scratching the fabric of the mattress. I got up and went to her door. It was slightly ajar, and I could hear a faint, muffled whisper. It wasn't my sister's voice, it was higher pitched, almost like the sound of a poorly tuned radio. When I pushed the door open, I found Sophia fast asleep, lying on her side with the doll pressed against her chest. The room was dark, but the doll's glass eyes reflected the streetlight streaming through the window. I swear to God, for a second, I thought the eyes moved to look at me. I quickly shut the door and went back to my room, heart racing, telling myself I was imagining things. The next day, I tried to ignore what had happened. I was convinced it was just paranoia, something my mind made up in the middle of the night. But Sophia's behavior started to change. She was usually talkative, always making up stories and games, but that day she was unusually quiet. She spent the whole morning in her room, sitting on the floor with the porcelain doll in front of her. The weird part was that she didn't seem to be playing, she just sat there, staring at the doll, like she was waiting for something. In the afternoon, when Mom called Sophia to lunch, she brought the doll with her to the table. Annoyed, I made a dumb comment, something like, "Leave that doll alone, it's not even real." For the first time, Sophia gave me a genuinely angry look. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was so cold it shut me up. And the most disturbing part? For a moment, I thought the doll's mouth was slightly more open than before, as if it was smiling. That night, I woke up again. The same sound. A faint scratching, like something being dragged across the floor. The silence of the house made the noise seem louder. I lay there for a few seconds, the blanket pulled up to my chin, trying to convince myself not to get out of bed. But then I heard something different, footsteps. Small, slow steps in the hallway. I thought it might be Sophia going to the bathroom, but when I looked at my bedroom door, I saw it was open. I was sure I'd closed it before going to sleep. Then something in the hallway caught my eye. It was a small figure, motionless, near Sophia's door. My heart nearly stopped. It was the doll. It was on the floor, sitting in a way that I knew wasn't normal. Its porcelain legs were bent at an odd angle, and its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it were watching me. I blinked several times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I didn't have the courage to leave my bed. I stayed there, frozen, until the sunlight started creeping into the hallway. In the morning, I pretended nothing had happened. Who would believe me anyway? Even so, I couldn't bring myself to look at the doll when I saw it again in Sophia's room, now sitting perfectly on her bed, aligned with the pillows. Sophia seemed normal, but she was even more attached to the doll than before. I tried playing with her, suggesting other activities, but it was like my sister couldn't hear me. Every time I spoke, she just smoothed the doll's hair or adjusted its dress. The situation was starting to bother me in a way I couldn't explain. That night, I made a decision. After everyone had gone to bed, I went into Sophia's room and took the doll. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to act. I carried the doll to the basement, placed it inside an old shoebox, and covered it with some worn-out towels. I didn't know exactly what I was trying to do, I just wanted to get that thing out of sight. When I shut the basement door, I felt an almost immediate sense of relief. For a few hours, I thought I had solved the problem. But around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound even worse than before. It was a repetitive noise, like something banging against wood. As much as my instincts screamed at me to stay in bed, the noise was too loud to ignore. I left my room, my eyes still adjusting to the darkness, and walked toward the basement. Each step made me more nervous. When I reached the door, I realized the noise was coming from inside. The basement door was locked. I had locked it myself. But the noise didn't stop, and now it sounded more violent, like something was trying to get out. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, unable to muster the courage to open it. That's when I heard a whisper. Soft, just like on the first night. Only this time, it came directly from the other side of the door. "Why did you hide me?" It was a high-pitched voice, almost childlike, but it carried a tone of anger that chilled my blood. I let go of the doorknob and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I couldn't sleep properly for the rest of the night. I just kept staring at my bedroom door. The house was silent again, but my heart was still racing. I kept replaying what I'd heard, the voice, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, that maybe I was just tired, or that the noise had been something else entirely. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with that doll. In the morning, I acted like nothing had happened. I went to school, but my mind was elsewhere. I had to figure out how to get rid of that thing, but how? My mom wasn't the type to believe in weird stories, and my dad would probably say I was making it all up to mess with Sophia. So, when I got home and saw Sophia alone on the couch, I took the chance. I asked her if she missed the doll, and to my surprise, she said no. She responded with a blank smile, "She visited me last night." The way she said it, like it was the most normal thing in the world, sent a chill down my spine. That night, I decided to end it once and for all. I waited until everyone was asleep and went to the basement. The house was completely silent. When I reached the basement door, I opened it slowly, holding my phone's flashlight. The box where I'd put the doll was in the corner, exactly where I had left it. But the towels covering the doll were scattered on the floor. I grabbed the box and took it to the backyard. My plan was simple: burn it. I knew it sounded insane, but I felt it was the only way to end this. I placed the box on the ground and opened it, pouring alcohol over it. The doll was there, wearing the same smile as always, but her eyes looked scarier now than ever before. When I struck a match and dropped it in, the fire caught immediately, but what happened next was something no one would believe. As the fire consumed the box, the doll's smile seemed to change. It was as if the porcelain came alive, warping as the flames grew. The glassy sheen in its eyes intensified, and I swear I saw a tear roll down its cheek, though it shouldn't have been possible. Then the sound started, a high-pitched scream, like it was coming from inside the doll itself. It wasn't the sound of something burning, it was the sound of someone, a child, screaming in pain. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place, mesmerized by the horrific scene, unable to believe it was real. The fire began to die down, shrinking until it finally went out. When I looked at the box, the doll was untouched. Nothing had burned. It was still there, wearing the same unsettling smile, but now a thin crack ran down its forehead, extending to the side of its face. I felt a presence behind me and quickly turned, but there was nothing there. Or at least, nothing I could see. I picked the doll back up, unsure of what else to do, and ran into the house, throwing the doll onto the living room floor and locking myself in my bedroom. That night, I had a nightmare. I was in a room that seemed familiar but wasn't mine. It was a small space with gray walls. In the center of the room, the doll sat on an old chair, leaning forward slightly as if watching me. In the dream, I couldn't move. My legs felt glued in place, and my arms were heavy as lead. The doll began to speak, but her mouth didn't move. "You can't destroy me," the voice said. "I always come back." I woke up sweating, gasping for air, and the first thing I did was look at my bedroom door. It was ajar again. This time, it wasn't a noise that had woken me, but that same feeling, the unmistakable sense of being watched. I knew she was there, somewhere in the house, waiting. Fear consumed me, and I finally accepted that this wasn't just a doll. It was something far worse, something I had provoked by trying to get rid of her. After that night, things got worse quickly. Sophia began to get sick. She stopped leaving her room and barely spoke to any of us. My mom thought it was a virus, but I knew it wasn't. Every time I passed her bedroom door, I felt something strange. And the doll. She was always in the same place, sitting on the head of Sophia's bed, with those unblinking eyes fixed on anyone who entered. Sophia insisted she didn't want to be separated from it, saying the doll was her friend. I knew I needed help. I searched the internet for anything I could find about porcelain dolls, curses, or similar stories. That's when I came across something, a Chinese legend about dolls that carry the spirits of dead children. According to the story, these dolls are created in rituals to preserve a child's spirit, but if abandoned or mistreated, they can become vengeful. I didn't know if that was what I was dealing with, but everything started to make sense. I knew I had to act quickly, before it hurt Sophia, or any of us. On the last night the doll was with us, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. I ran to Sophia's room, but she wasn't there. Her bed was a mess, and the window was wide open, though it was impossible for anyone to have climbed out. On the floor, amidst shards of broken glass, lay the doll. But this time, she wasn't intact. Her porcelain face was completely cracked, as if it had been smashed. When I approached, I smelled something foul, a mix of burning and decay. Then I heard the footsteps again, but this time they weren't in the hallway. They were coming from downstairs. I ran, shouting Sophia's name, and found her curled up on the couch, crying. My mom and dad came running into the living room right after me. Sophia couldn't explain how she'd gotten there or what had happened. She just kept repeating, between sobs, she said she'll come back. My parents thought she'd had a nightmare, and I decided not to say anything. I just nodded along. The next day, the doll was gone. It wasn't in Sophia's room, the basement, or anywhere else in the house. My mom thought Sophia had lost it, but I knew the truth. The thing had left, but not because it wanted to. It left because it was done with us. To this day, whenever I walk down an empty hallway or hear a strange noise at night, I wonder, did she really leave? Or is she just waiting for the right moment to come back?
Hello. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. This helps us grow and bring even more new content. Thank you, and see you next time.